Dr. Kurt Knoerl is an associate professor of history at Georgia Southern University's Savannah campus, specializing in maritime history, maritime archaeology, and digital history. His research focuses on Savannah's maritime cultural landscape, particularly African American and Gullah Geechee interactions with coastal waterways. He also serves on the Chatham County Historic Preservation Commission and the Ossabaw Island Foundation Board of Trustees.
Up until that time, maritime historians and archaeologists tended to focus on a boat. You know, I'd say, well, even when I went to get my master's degree from East Carolina in 1988, usually the common talk amongst the students was, what boat are you going to study? And Westerdahl was saying, you've got to look at this not in a vacuum, not in isolation, as part of a much broader scheme. Was it part of a flotilla? Were they associated with things going on the shore? And for instance, this is Fort Niagara on where the Niagara River hits Lake Ontario during the colonial period. The British fur trade offices, the fur traders were down there, the Indian Department offices were here, the military was there. These vessels all worked in concert to supply this. So to look at this by itself is really to be just too narrowly focused. You'll learn more about this boat when you learn about its relationship to all this other stuff. So that's the concept of the maritime cultural landscape. I'm teaching material culture class. Lily was in my material culture class many years ago. And the idea I try to stress is that these things can't just be looked at by themselves. We have to know, why was it there? Who was using it? What role did it play? And that's the process I try to use. So I'd like to sort of give you a tour around Georgia of different time periods and ways that the maritime landscape can be seen. Ossabaw Island is currently one of the places that I'm working with one of my graduate students. It's about 10 miles long and it's about 8 miles wide at its widest point. The gentleman's name is Caleb Hartshorn. He's going to defend his master's next week, actually. Caleb and I have been stomping around all over this island, just looking for any evidence of maritime activity. And now this island has been in use for thousands of years by humans. So this is a bit outdated. At the time I produced this map with Caleb, we had located 47 sites, but I'd say we're probably up to closer to 80 now, because we've kind of gotten up to Bradley Point up here, and we've done a bit more research in these other areas as well. Just things that are on the surface. We've not done any digging for this. And the time periods covered here are enormous. So for instance, pre-contact sites, there are at least 150 known Native American shell mounds, shell middens across the island, and sites. But we had actually found some additional ones that the state wasn't aware of. There's just so much out there. So here's an example of a shell midden. In fact, this thing is an enormous shell ring. It's bigger than this room. If you took this room and made this into a big circle, that's about the size of this, for 5-6 feet deep. And here you can see trash pits of the color of the soil and the materials that have been deposited in there. This is being eroded away on the south side of the island. In fact, not too far from here, there's a burial mound, and occasionally the state has to go out there to make sure nobody's coming out of it. And when they do find someone coming out of it, then they bury them at other undisclosed places on the island, in consultation with Native communities to make sure that everybody's okay with what we're doing out there. So this can go back at least 4,000 years of human activity on the island. Caleb and I were finding other materials. If you look at the enslaved tabby cabins on the island that were in use in the late 18th century into the 19th century, the enslaved were actually mining those shell middens for the shell and then creating the tabby walls for their homes. So it's not unusual to find Native American ceramics embedded in the wall. You can see a jawbone right here. I think there's another piece of ceramic here. So you can see where one aspect of that maritime landscape is being incorporated into a different landscape later on. We're also finding ceramics at different places. This is as you can see, a potentially 1,000-year-old ceramic This just happened to be in the root ball of a tree that had fallen over next to the path we were walking by. And we happened to walk behind it, and there was like, there it is. So the state came out and actually recovered this one because they were afraid with the rainwater this was going to wash out and be lost. So they actually did recover that. Plus, this was not in a site that they expected it to be in. These are some of the other students that I brought out to the ceramics right up there, out to the site. Other Native American canoes. Georgia's rivers have a lot of Native American canoes, let me tell you. Although this one didn't come from a river, now that I should say that. This canoe was reportedly found, Native American canoe on Cumberland Island sometime in the 70s, like the early 70s. And then the rumor was that, A, the rumor was that they found one. B, the other rumor was that it had been dumped in a pond at Fort King George. So 50 some years later, the state archaeologist called me and said, you want to come down and see if we can find this thing, if it actually exists? So I went down to Fort King George. This gentleman came up from Florida. He brought with him a little sort of a sonar that we attached to a boogie board. And the whole pond wasn't even as wide as this room. And we pulled it across looking for it. We didn't find it. There was no sign of the dugout canoe. So he had just climbed out of the water, and I was about to get out of the water. And I said, there was a sign at the other side that said, alligators are wild animals, leave them alone. And we had made sure he wasn't home when we were in this pond. So I said, well, somebody get my picture underneath that. So I'm backing up through the water, reached down, stood up. I said, I found the canoe. I think he was a little annoyed that I found it with my foot rather than the sonar, but we did find it. So we lifted it up so they could take a picture of it. It's missing this chunk here. Otherwise it was intact. So we placed it back down at the bottom. I still wanted my photo. So we kept going, and then I found the other half of it. So I have very sensitive feet and prehistoric canoes. But
how old was it?
So this one has not been dated yet, but it's likely pre-contact. And with canoes like this, because the styles don't change that much in these pre-contact canoes, this could be anywhere from 1,000 to, a few thousand years old, or maybe just a few hundred years old. There's a lake in Florida, Lake Noonan, I think, where they found, I want to say, 100 to 200 canoes all along the shore. And the age range there was from like 500 years, and some of them were 4,000 years old or something. They have an enormous time span here. But the design prospects for these, there aren't that many things you can change when you're hollowing out a log. However, as I said, there were other canoes being pulled out of rivers. This one came from the Oconee River, about 3 hours northwest of Savannah, that I was asked to go look at by a gentleman who was going down the river looking for things like this, illegally recovering Native American ceramics. And he told me he had a canoe in his barn. So he showed me this. And I said, why did you cut this in half with a chainsaw? And he said, well, it was flipped over. I thought it was a log, so I cut it in half. But I also couldn't help but notice that it was just the size you needed to be to fit into a van that he had. So I suspect that actually he cut it in half to get it into the van. Now, anything that's on state bottomlands like that belongs to the people of Georgia. So he knew that I was working pretty closely with the state archaeologist. So he was cooperative in the state coming out and recovering this. And it's been sent and conserved and put in a museum in Western Georgia, although I don't know the name of the museum. So this one was recovered. So it's sort of a happy story there. I get it when fishermen find things in the river. It's exciting. They may not be aware of the laws in terms of pulling things off the bottom. I mean, any archaeologist who says they're not excited when they find things, I think needs to get another job. Because, I mean, you should be excited about this. But the problem is if they don't know what to do with the material, it can have dire consequences. So for an example, there was a 25-foot long intact dugout canoe found in the Geechee River near the Savannah-Geechee Canal by some fishermen. And intact, 25 feet. And they didn't really know what to do with it. So unfortunately, they allowed it to get dry. And what happens is as the water evaporates, the wood cell structure is weak. It collapses, which means it opens up some more. It's a horrible cycle. this 3-foot piece is all that's left. The 25-foot long canoe. Now, this one was radiocarbon dated to be 1,000 years old. So it's on display at the Savannah Geechee Canal Museum, but it's a shame that that's all that's left of it. But at least I can use it to kind of tell people about that story. So while we don't want to seem like we're just real downers on people finding things, the best thing to do is to leave it where it is, call the state, say, hey, I found this, get credit for being the person who found it, and then, you know, help it get into the right hands. Because that canoe survived for 1,000 years sitting in the river. Once you pull it out of that environment, the chemistry changes, everything changes. And if you don't have the money for conservation, you can see what happens. I don't want to be too much of a downer, but that's the pitch I'd make to folks when they get excited about finding things. So we'll switch gears here and look at other maritime landscapes and the colonial period. As I'm sure most of the people here know, Georgia was set up partly to be a buffer between the Spanish in St. Augustine and the wealthy colony in Charleston, South Carolina. Also, it was set up to be a place where we could grow grapes, so we could avoid buying French wines, and silk, so we could avoid buying silk from Asia. Neither of those two industries worked out. Surprisingly, it's still just a little too cold for silkworms, although they tried. And as you know, we're not really known to be the Sonoma Valley of the East. I went to a wine store in Georgia to buy a bottle of wine for my friend in Virginia, who's a wine connoisseur. I said, can you recommend a good bottle of Georgia wine? He said, yeah, we don't make that. So that didn't work out. But the colony itself was, from the very beginning, had a maritime focus to it, right? It's on the river, not as by an accident, because that's how you travel. Even in the earliest stages, the focus is actually, even in this drawing, the focus is right here on the waterfront. A combination of three-masted ships, schooners, and small boats. Even Hutchinson Island, where I did that archaeology, is already in use. The focus for the colony is having infrastructure that can provide access to the water, because that's where the trade is, right? So right from the get-go, it's got a maritime focus. If you walk around Savannah, you will see other things that are related to that maritime history, even if they're not in use anymore. The harbor range light, which I think is from the 1840s, but don't hold me to that date. The ubiquitous anchors that you'll see around, these are all elements that were working aspects of the landscape, now are performing decorative functions. Fort Pulaski, while people focus their attention on that, right outside the fort is the landing area for the small town that had existed when they were building the site. Town's gone, but this is what's left of the landing. And then Coxborough Island Light. You can't walk around Savannah without seeing these things, if you know where to look. Even the very identity of people is recorded in the use of maritime symbols in their graves. And shipwrecks are a huge part of the maritime landscape, of course. As this advertisement from the 1760s talks about how there's a new boat ready to sail. Any person willing to ship indigo or deerskins may apply to Alexander and Fife Company, 1765. That's sort of that right in the middle of that period where the earliest successful economic enterprise in Georgia was actually the fur trade. Pulling skins down from places like Augusta to the coast, which is pretty typical of most colonies, English colonies, all the way up to Maine. The first successful ones are usually the fur trade. But yet they're getting into indigo. So you see that shift away from the furs, maybe to later on rice and eventually, obviously, cotton. Two remnants of that, these were both discovered on Ossabaw Island, are ship timbers, and likely dating to the 18th century. They haven't been radiocarbon dated, but what tells me they're 18th century is the fact that they lack iron for the most part, and they have wood, what they call tree nails or trunnels, for attachment places rather than spikes or iron. You can see the trunnels here. This would have been near the stern or the bow of the ship as the rounded vessel starts to get sharp. This one has a little metal concretion. That's likely a drift pin that would have went through that into the keel. Other than that, though, this is all wood. So there are elements of this aspect of the maritime landscape that are still out there to be discovered. And of course, if you've spent any time walking around Savannah down by the streets, you're walking on top of ship's ballast. As boats would come in, they dump these stones into the river to make room for cargo. And this became a problem even so quickly as 1763, where they said, you got to stop doing this. And in the early 1800s, they actually start using these stones to pave the streets and actually build the buildings. And as I pointed out to students, when you look at these, you're going to see that most of them are fairly smooth. And yes, some of that is due to traffic, but it's also, you're seeing someone's thought process. If you were a boat captain and you've gone up to a rocky beach to get stones for your ballast, which keeps the boat steady in the water, you don't want jagged stones because they're going to dig into the wood timbers of your ship. So you're looking for smooth stones. So these are purposely picked. Now, there are hundreds of thousands of these stones. And some of you may have heard about this, but they had to do some street repairs around a manhole. And when they did that, they discovered that one of the stones had Chinese writing on it. Turns out to be somebody's tombstone from the 1790s.
No.
Poor guy, his tombstones end up as a tourist attraction in Savannah.
There's a menu.
So this is now in the City Hall Rotunda when they found this. And my thinking was, and I don't have time to do this, but out of the hundreds of thousands of stones that are in those streets and those buildings, I can't believe we found the only one with writing. I'm sure that there's more out there. I'd love to do a survey of that or go looking for something like that. Or if nothing else, look and get a survey sampling of what types of stones are used, because none of these are from Georgia. They're not from that area. So you're seeing global trade right here. So I need to get a geologist who's really interested in this to work with me.
Only we do.
Oh, hi. You're Knoerl. So that's something that I would really like to do. Just do a sample and kind of get a sense of the trade. And of course, along Factors Walk, the use of Savannah gray bricks, which were created with enslaved labor from upriver, many of which actually have the fingerprints of the people who helped create them. It's a somewhat moving and creepy thing when you find them along the walls there. Turning to historic canoes, not native canoes, canoes were sort of like the small pickup truck of their day, widely used and especially used by the enslaved community in Savannah for daily routines, for moving around rice plantations, for gathering extra food for the families, and used for running away. I guess you wouldn't call it running, paddling away to freedom. The newspapers, advertisements of the day, loaded with advertisements where they indicate that their enslaved worker has taken a canoe and headed off. But even outside of the enslaved, you can see the value of these because even if they were stolen or just lost or stolen, even if they had nothing to do with the enslaved, people are paying for advertisements to get these things back. As you can see from these, and the combination of the enslaved and canoes are actually being rented out by the day for people. It's a big part of the local economy and life in the city. So when I get calls sometimes from the state to look at historic period canoes, as you can see here, I drag a few of my students with me. Lily knows these two. These are her classmates from back in the day. This one I thought was, I've never seen one like this with the beautiful wine glass stern carved into it. Because of the level of detail here, I kind of thought from looking at it that this might have been 1830s, 1840s. Turns out after carbon dating, it's actually 18th century. So someone put a lot of time into carving that. It's still owned by the state, but it's on loan to the Georgia Southern University Museum. And they've had it in exhibits in the past. Here's another type of boat that's come out of a Georgia river, the Oconee. This is a 27-foot long chine girder. It's a single piece of wood carved into the shape of an L. You can see a drawing of a flatboat, whereas the drawing has planks here. This case, they just made it out of one solid piece of wood. And then there was a matching piece on the other side, and you connect it with planks going across like this. And two fishermen, these gentlemen, found it and pulled it out of the river and took it home. And then contacted the state to sort of get information about it, when the state said, well, that's very nice, but keep this. And so I took a student with me to go see that. It was about 3 hours away, and another professor. And the student, Alyssa, who had taken my maritime class because it just happened to fit into her schedule. But I'll take any students I can. She came with me and the other professor. By the time we got home, she had already done so much research that she was going to do an honors paper on it. I convinced her to go to the Society for Historical Archaeology conference and give, as an undergraduate, a presentation at that conference, which she did. And while she was there, I introduced her to people from East Carolina University's maritime program, who accepted her and funded her to come back in the fall for her master's degree.
Wow.
She's graduated, and she's now the operations director for the Wisconsin Maritime Museum. Just fit into her class. So I've either given her an exciting career or I've ruined her life. I'm not sure which. But she did her master's project on this. She actually went back into the Oconee looking for more evidence for this thing. We know this is 18th century from a radiocarbon date. And again, here's those trunnels that we're talking about. And from looking at the patterns of how those holes were laid out, she was able to determine the width of the planks that went across. And she was actually able to pull a lot of info out. And she actually recreated a scale model of this thing with a traditional boat builder. That was all part of her master's. In other areas of maritime landscape, rice farming. Throughout the 19th century into the early days of the 20th century before it sort of disappeared. This is a fairly recent photo, I-95 near Darien. You can still see, even though they're not used for rice plantations anymore, you can still see the impacts of the landscape for the drainage. This is an area that I want to get more involved in terms of searching through these abandoned rice fields to see if there's evidence of the rice gates. This is a recreation in a nature reserve in South Carolina. But there was also rice mills that would have been available out here where they were processing this and getting it ready to ship. To me, this is really suspicious that it's this much attached to this canal. So I really want to get permission to go back and check this out. But this is a whole other area. Then they would have had canoes and all kinds of crafts for that.
Why does it look square?
That because they would have had these set up for drainage so they could control the flow using a rice gate and a trunk for when they have to flood it and keeping any salt water out. That was a process of rice farming. You had to control when
I mean the area that you were pointing at.
This area here?
Yes.
Yeah.
Looks like a square.
Yeah, it does a bit there, doesn't it? I suspect that is the course of the water. But that does make me suspicious, especially squared off like that. That looks like you'd have a building or something there.
Right.
So there could be an abandoned rice mill. Let's go look. But of course, the rest of these lines, and if you look at Google Earth around Savannah, you're going to see this all over the place. I went out on the Geechee with a boat to take a quick look at some of that. And the one thing I did see as we went along are big alligators coming down off those and lots of hogs, a lot of hogs. So you have it's keep your eyes open while you're out there. But I'm looking forward to exploring these. Stepping back in time a little bit to the colonial era, this is Wormslow State Historic Site right here. The whole avenue of oaks that most people are get their wedding pictures and stuff, that's right here. This was given to a guy named Noble Jones in the 1730s and 40s. He's one of the early founders of Savannah. Oglethorpe gave it to him. His job, though, he built this tabby house fort right here because the navigable waterway wasn't here. It went this way, right by his house fort and then out here. Construction of the Diamond Causeway and then the dredging, the skidaway changed the navigable waterway, but it used to be right past his place. So Jones was given two small periaugers, which are like, think really, really big canoes, and with a cannon in the bow to keep the Spanish from sneaking up the back. This is sort of the back door to Savannah. You can get up to the Savannah River pretty close to the city by coming up this way. So he patrolled that area, and there was some thought that those two vessels he had might have been abandoned in this marsh area. So there was a descendant of Knoerl Jones who still lives on the property, actually. Most of it has been given to the state for the park, but the Barrow family still lives there. Donated money to do a magnetometer search to look for those boats. Magnetometers, if you're not familiar, are sort of like just big metal detectors. But it's marsh grass. You can't pull a boat through there. So we had to find a different way to do it. And I invited some people from the University of Miami who brought a hexacopter and it towed the magnetometer and they flew it back and forth over the marsh. Call that mowing the grass. You just go back and forth.
Wow.
Did not find the boats. I wasn't surprised because I think my comments about the trunnels, there probably wasn't any metal in those boats and they wouldn't have abandoned the cannon. So I didn't actually have much hope for finding these, but I did relish the opportunity to do the survey because sometimes you find other things. So, and we did actually find other things. Not the colonial boats, but we did locate an earthen causeway. This is a LiDAR image. This did not come from the magnetometer, but it shows you the depths. But notice this line here. The Confederates had a gun battery over here. And when the Union was coming up towards Skidaway, they had built an earthen causeway as an escape route to Long Island. It's not an island now, but it was then. And they went up Long Island to a bridge to Isle of Hope where they had another gun battery. And they destroyed that bridge on their way out. So I saw this on the map and I went to this point on the island. This is what I saw. And even though the land doesn't go any higher, it did change the way the vegetation grows. So we're able to actually see where that line was. So for one of my maritime archaeology classes, I took students out here to see what we could find on this island. When Sherman captured Savannah in the Civil War, he issued the Special Order 15, which gave 40 acres and a mule, the Barrier Sea Islands, to the freedmen. And 3 or 4 families had been given this island to work. So we went out there. This is the superintendent of Wormslow State Historic Site, Gretchen Greminger. She and I did sort of like a pre-survey to make sure, because I had to make sure there'd be something for the students to work on. And we found this circular pond and some ditches. And I said, all right, we can map these. We'll see what this is all about. So the students came out and explored with me and helped find a series of these drainage ditches that all connect back to the pond. So that is, or what probably was used for Sea Island cotton farming. The State Historic Site had no idea that these were out there. We also found a smaller pond here that had one ditch coming to it and one that we think, may have crossed the island at one point. We also found remnants of what might be 2 house sites. They're not shown on the map because the state has asked us not to divulge where those locations are. But the students really liked the fact that they were finding something new, contributing sort of to the history of the State Historic Site, to finding, in a sense, a new source of history. And they find that very rewarding and engaging. Going up towards I should say back to the American Revolution, this is a map of the siege of Savannah along the riverfront. You can see here's the British lines and the French and American positions up here, as well as firing lines from the water. Very concerned about the water because the French Navy was helping the Americans out. I'm going to zoom into parts of this to see what the British response was. So they intentionally sank ships, blocked the waterways, and had these other vessels there. But the French also produced a map from their perspective, sort of flipped around here. So here are the American and French lines, the British lines. These are the ships that we saw on the other map. But notice these ships over here with the smoke drawn in, and some ships up there. Zoom in. And what we've got are English ships that were burned when the French ships approached. The English galley failed. Burning done in a hurry. And this is probably the source for the 20 cannon from the American Revolution that were found in the Savannah River. They were thought to come from 3 different vessels, one of which they haven't identified yet. And they not unusual for these cannon to be of various countries because as long as it was the same caliber, it really didn't matter if you had a French gun on an English ship. As long as you could fire your 6-pounder or your 8-pounders, that was fine. So most of these were sent to Texas A&M for conservation. And they've been working on them to remove the salts from the water out of the iron and then to coat them and preserve them. And you can see some examples here, how that looks. These are going to come back to Savannah. They'll be at the Savannah History Museum. They discovered that there are basically about 4 different types of guns. These are laser scans of those cannon, looking for details to help identify them. And one of the surprising things was that almost all of the intact cannon were loaded. And the reason what that tells us is they abandoned these in a hurry because they didn't even fire them. They just set the ships on fire and got out of there. And some historians had thought that the British were really kind of running low on supplies, but some of these cannon were double loaded, double shotted. So that might pull that into question. Why would you take the trouble to double shot this and then not fire it? Just abandon it like that. So still questions to be answered, but also tricky for the conservator to treat a loaded gun. You've got to be very careful because the envelope, the linen paper cartridge still had the powder in it. Move a bit further west. Anybody here been to Rome, Georgia? This is the intersection of the Etowah, of the Coosa, and I can never remember the third one. So the
Custanala.
Thank you, Custanala. And if you've ever gone down to see this, there are 2 steamboats that are, at least 2, I should say, that are wrecked in the river here. And if I remember this correctly from when I was there, this is a cemetery. And if you stood on this hill and looked down, it looked like there was a river of chocolate milk and a river of crystal clear water coming together. And you could see that straight line. I don't know if it's always like that, but it was like that when we were there. I had the good fortune to work on the Dixie, which was in the clear water part of things, whereas some of my friends were working on the other side, which was pretty much zero visibility. But these are, even this far inland, it's still a maritime community, still maritime influences over towns, and these vessels are still there. And then going, I think, west and slightly south to FDR State Park. In the 40s, I believe, they had this recreational lake that had been created with a dam. And then a few years ago, they had to drain the lake to do some repairs on the dam. And when they did that, they discovered that there were boats sunk in the water there. You can see in this one, the intentional hole used to sink these. There were 4 of this style and 2 that were more like flat-ended or square-ended boats. And unfortunately, it doesn't show up in this picture, but we also saw, besides the boats, again, don't look at the boat just by itself. What's the landscape like? Well, it's there because of these recreational opportunities. So in other parts of the lake, we found fishing bobbers and old Coke bottles and old 1960s era goggles for scuba masks. And unfortunately, it doesn't show them there. All over the lake are crib structures full of rock to create habitat for fish. And you can just see them all over the lake. And I believe they've filled this back in now, but there was some talk about removing one of these, but this stuff was built out of the flimsiest marine plywood, 1/4 inch. And I told them, I said, you try to lift this up, it's just going to completely fall apart. So I suspect they're still there at the bottom of the lake. It just occurred to me, I wonder what happened to the fish when they did this. Thought about that before. So they restocked the whole thing. And then off the coast, this is Jekyll Island, a World War II I don't really know what it is. It came off a Liberty ship. It's not a lifeboat. It's heavily built, really heavy built, with these tanks attached here. For which purpose, I'm not really sure, but there had been a brass plate on it, and a storm had come through and uncovered this. So it was visible for a while. I don't have a photo of it, but I came back a month later with the Jekyll Island Historic Authority, and somebody had taken an axe to this.
Oh.
That chopped through to see if there's any gold in there. Because every shipwreck ever went down gets gold on it. So we were hoping that the storm would rebury the thing quickly. And that typically will happen, they'll come and get buried again. But yeah, they really went to town on it. But this is, evidence of World War II activity right there on the beach. Now, so for my classrooms, I really do use these field experiences to get students excited about history, not just archaeology, but history, because the archaeology is only there to get to the history, right? We're always trying to make that leap from the thing to the people. This is one of my students, Bobby Carpenter, who later went on to do maritime master's degree at UGA. He had sent me an email a few months ago saying he just got hired by FEMA for emergency response for historic sites. I don't know if he's still there or not. I'm afraid to ask. But he's one of my success stories. I've taught small boat recording to students out in the field. This is the Miss Helen. It's an oyster bateau built by the Gullah Geechee community in Pinpoint. It's probably the last Gullah Geechee built oyster bateau from that area. It's outside of Russo Seafood. Mr. Russo had bought it in the 1980s. Miss Helen was in her, I think, close to 90 at the time. This boat will never go anywhere because if we try to pick it up now, the bottom would fall out. So my students measured it, took the lines off of it, created a set of drawings. 2 of the students came through and made half models out of it. So when that boat's gone, we've got the data preserved. Other boat builders, students have done oral histories. This is a gentleman who went over to Ghana on a Fulbright scholarship and worked with local sea-going or ocean-going dugout canoes and actually built 2 of them and brought them back to the United States. He gave them to me. My students used them for a while, did oral histories with him about them, and then we turned them over to an African-American history museum in Statesboro. Rusty Fleetwood here is a gentleman who's published books on tidewater of the Southeast US and actually built this small 18th century style yawl boat that the students came out and listened to him talk about what it was like to build this. So get them out there, get them to meet people, and then get them on shipwreck sites. So this is off of Pinpoint Heritage Museum, which was an oyster and crab processing Gullah community plant in Pinpoint, Georgia. And right next to it had been a small wooden boat that had been used for oystering and experiments with oystering. They were trying to see if you could lay chicken wire and create new oyster beds. There was chicken wire all over it. It took me a while to figure out why is there chicken wire all over this. But and the flags are where they have probed to find the wooden remains, because all the wood above the mud has been eaten by microbes and destroyed, but below the mud it's been pretty well preserved. So we probed, and they'd find a frame or rib, and they'd figure out where does it end, and then they marked it so they could map all this. And we found the engines right here. You can see the mud, the conditions here. This was muddy, it was dirty, we were getting eaten alive by the no-see-ums, and they loved it. They just absolutely loved being out there. I'm getting too old for this, but they were like, this is great. Yeah, so they had a really good time getting, and at the end, they produced a really good site map that we were able to turn over to the Oyster Museum, because here's the museum, and it's right off the back dock, so that they could use this for their interpretation and talking to their visitors about this. The students were really happy to have been able to create that. And they did a nice job with the map too, I thought. Also, this gives us an opportunity to engage with the public. Down at Harris Neck Fish and Wildlife Refuge, that community had been a thriving Gullah Geechee oyster community. They had their own processing plants, they had their own boats. But just prior or at World War II, the entire community was thrown off the land through eminent domain to create an Army airstrip for training. After the war, they tried to make it a municipal airport. That failed. The community, who just moved outside of that, still wanted it back, but they turned it into a fish and wildlife refuge. So the community, some of the community now, descendants of the Gullah Geechee who work there, are working with the Fish and Wildlife to sort of record the family's history. And they were roughly of where one of the oyster homes and processing sites were. So I teamed with their archaeologists to bring my students down. And our initial plan was to, when every time we saw an artifact on the surface, we'd flag it. Well, this is all artifacts. So we quickly changed gears because there were tens of thousands of artifacts laying in the mud there. So we decided to flag types of artifacts. So an example of ceramics, an example of bottles, of machinery from the oyster processing. But in determining how big this site was, we worked with the descendants of the community, the Gullah Geechee community. And I was really proud of the students because they were incredibly respectful. And there was probably about, I want to say 10 or 15 folks that came out to work with us. This gentleman and his son, as we were going along the edge of the marsh there, found these crab trap buoys. And this gentleman said, "These are my grandfather's numbers."
Wow.
So, I mean, we have that on video too. It was really cool. And the connection that developed the bond between my students and them, when my students gave a talk at the Jetson Center in downtown Savannah, 20 members of the family came up from an hour away to hear them talk. So it was good for my students. It was good for the reputation of the university. It was good for these folks to help recover because it's their story, not ours, right? So, in fact, before we ever did this, I went down and met with the field archaeologist and 4 or 5 members of the community, because their question was, why do you want to do this? What is this to you? I found this remarkably similar to when I did my dissertation research in the Upper Great Lakes, when I worked with Anishinaabe and Ojibwe communities, because most of the time the response is, no, we're not going to talk to you. Why wouldn't we talk to you? And that's, well, I'm trying to tell the right story. And like, it's not your story to tell. Fortunately, I was able to eventually make my way into that community. And once you gain that level of trust, then you have to honor your word. And so this was just a great experience for everybody all around, I think. I also gave my students the opportunity to learn some new technologies, GIS, mapping technology, very marketable skill to be able to do that kind of mapping. And there's that excitement of going out and finding new sites. This is Caleb Hartshorn, who went while he was an undergrad, who later did the Ossabaw trip with me as a master's student, because he really got into it after having that field experience. And of course, I like the students to always have a publicly facing project at the end of it. So one of the assignments was the students had to go out across Savannah, find remnants of the maritime landscape, map it through location, photograph it, and we create a digital map that that when you see it, shows you where some of these sites are, and then you can read about them. And we had asked the city archives to link to this, and they did. And then they came back to me and said, "Hey, we like what you did with this. We have," this isn't maritime, but it's still cool. We have W.W. Law's papers. He was a civil rights leader in Savannah. He's NAACP president, participating in the sit-ins. He also gave tours of African American history around Savannah for like 20 years. When he died in 2002, all of his notes went to the archives, and they said, "We'd like to recreate his tour." And he had like 7 or 8 different versions of his notes, handwritten, typed up, you name it. So my students in another class took that, recreated it digitally like this, and then year before last, we decided to update that by doing an audio recording. So if people didn't want to read it, they could listen to it. And we always started each site with a quote from Law's notes, and then the research my students did. So I asked this young man, Marcello Grady, to be the voice of W.W. Law in the recordings. And so I built a little recording studio. And Marcello is now a social studies teacher. He went off and got his master's to teach that. So that's up there now for people to listen to. So just to wrap this up, the range of time periods, the subject matter related to maritime isn't just on the coast, it's all over the state. We barely scratched the surface. I think one of the most valuable things about it is the opportunity to use that to get students really excited about history. And as we always follow that up with the academic research, makes the finding the documentary sources a lot more exciting when you can relate that to the real world outside. I just saw a sticker our department put together. It said, Georgia Southern History Department, we read dead people's letters. And I thought, yeah, we do, but there's a bit more to that. I mean, we kind of connect it to the real world. So with that, I just say thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it. Yeah.
I actually live in downtown Rome. I'm very familiar with the Dixie.
Okay.
What is the other shipwreck? Because I've never heard there was another.
I have to go back and look at the report. I haven't, it was from 2004.
Okay.
But if you want, send me an email, and I'll see if I can get a soft copy of the report. But there was a second vessel, at least. I only worked on the Dixie because I didn't work on it. It was up the, what was the name of the other river?
Custanella?
Yeah, Custanella, sorry. Custanella. I didn't want to mispronounce that. Yeah.
I was curious, you talked about the ancient canoes that you find in rivers and how they were unchanged for so many years. And then when you get to the historic era, you can sort of tell the difference. Is that like new tools that are introduced? Is it just like the keel that is, or the back of the boat you said look like a wine?
Yeah.
Wine still, that you can tell, or is there like historic canoes that look ancient type of things?
So the most common method for building the dugout canoes was to set fire on the inside and then straight them out with like clamshell and things like that. The historic canoes, you'll often see the adze mark where you've got the straight little chips from a 2 or 3 inch adze where they're hollowing that out. Still maybe doing some burning, but you can see a lot more tool marks. Plus, they would never have spent so much time to define that kind of a shape when you could just round it off. So, I mean, you can get that wrong. Believe me, you can get that wrong. But for the most part, and of course, after trade begins, Native Americans may be using some of those tools to build native canoes. And so there can be some confusion over that. And people borrowed from each other. The enslaved that were coming over for rice fields were from West Africa who had built rice canoes over there. And they had a very particular, very sharp pointed end to their canoes. So you start to see the colonial canoes start to look like this blend of West African and to somewhat native styles. So when you get to that period, it really gets cloudy. And those cases, you really got to look at more context, like where do we find this? What's it near? Are there any tool marks? Get the radiocarbon dating in there. Yeah, it gets a bit murkier when you get to that. But when you say that blunt end, like I'll walk into a museum and I've done this up in Wisconsin. I'll look at a canoe and they'll say, this is Native American canoe. And I'll look at it and I'll say, not necessarily. Looking at the way it's hollowed out, especially with their tool marks, then I've got to say, well, what's your reason for saying that? So, yeah.
What else would it be if it wasn't a Native American?
Well, in Georgia, they're using them for rice farming. And going up and down the rivers for fishing. So, you know, everyday life, really. Thank you very much.